Hello, Vincent.
Hello, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me responding to my request to be invited, I guess. Thank
No,
you.
I'm honored. I'm honored. Thank you so much. I've
I think your question is the question of our times in a way, right? I mean, it's so vital that people start asking that question in a really deep, authentic ways.
yeah, and I looking through your material, you've been asking this for some time.
Yeah,
Looks
it's
like.
been over 3 decades of asking this question in one form or another. Yeah.
I know. Well, it's an honor. Do you have any questions before we start?
No, just maybe a thumbnail on you and what's driving you. You know what you're trying to do with this, just as
Sure,
a context
sure.
for me.
Well, that's a good question. Also, well, two-pronged really. One, really wondering about what our systems, how they rubber band back to status quo post-COVID. I've worked on some projects with migrant students that were in this kind of virtual learning space. Um, been on a project for the last 11 years with them called the Dare to Dream Academies.
Hmm.
I work with the Association of Washington School Principals and offer them high school credit. So I've been part of a lot of alternative other learning experiences outside of this traditional schoolhouse. AWSP, I say, is we're a school without walls. So I'm just been associated with them for some years from the student leadership program from as a student. And I'm also running for state superintendent. It's not public knowledge yet. I'll announce in November in Washington State. So in
Wonderful.
2024.
Huh.
So that's part, and I want to understand from everyone, from Perez to superintendents, so that's part of
Did
my.
you ever encounter Don Nielsen?
No.
He was on the school board in Seattle and ran a principals institute for training principals up into new ways of thinking about educating. This was back in the '90s or so. Him and I were partners in something, and so uh, I've spent a lot of time in Seattle in different educational things, but quite a while ago. So
Yeah.
just checking. Yeah.
Any other frame? Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. That helps a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot to bring to traditional education from outside its box,
Yeah.
and I spent some time early on in the conception of different components of the preschool at Esalen. Okay, and then I spent some time at the Krishnamurti schools in Ojai. Um, And so I've been around a number of alternative educational systems, but of course we gravitate back to the mass of our populations going through this thing called public education,
Yep.
and it's got to get right in order for our society as a whole to get right. So
And really, my call is for public ed to be, for schools to be learning organizations.
yeah,
Why are
in
we not?
the Senge sense,
Yeah, that we are. Yeah, Peterson.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
as we really think about what the house, this house of learning, and what happens in these spaces, and how we don't learn ourselves.
Well, I think beyond this conversation, I would love to have more dive with you into some of that. Did you, if you remember Senge, did you spend any time with his part on David Bohm's work? Do you remember that?
No,
Oh,
no. This is still years ago that I'm returning now to this memory. Some of
okay.
this.
Oh, okay. Okay. But anyway, the Heart of the Learning Organization. If you look into that book, that whole body of
Yeah.
work, the center of it's on team learning. The center of team learning was based on the dialogue work of David Bohm, who was a physicist. He was the science teacher of the Dalai Lama, a spiritual son of Einstein, and came up with a different model of how humans could learn together in groups, which became the basis for a lot of what Senge did. And Senge and I actually collaborated on bringing David Bohm to speak at Apple Computer once. That's a
Oh, all
sidebar.
right.
That's an interesting thing if you're interested in the core of the learning organization work.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, yeah, your breadth and depth is just really. I'm honored that you're spending some time with me.
Oh, the honor's mine. Thank you. I mean, you're doing it. You're doing what's really important to gather people into this conversation. So, shall we dive into this?
I'm going to jump in here. Hit record.
Good.
Recording in progress.
You're okay with me recording it as well?
Please.
Okay, good. Good. All right.
Is that well? Thank you so much for being here. Could you please share a little bit with the audience, a little bit about you and what is your connection to public education?
Um, my name again is David Bolton. I have been on a crusade to change the way people think about learning and as it relates to the organizational systems of schools, but also more importantly, how it relates to the mission of education since the mid 80s. And that work took me from designing an electronic book and a new publishing system for focused on changing the kind of informational relationships between people that are learning and what they're learning from, to designing Apple Computer's first in-house desktop university, to work at MIT at organizational learning. I've been really concerned with what I call the health of children's learning, the healthiness of their interior attentional participation. That's been the core of my focus. And it so happened that my two kids were my learning lenses into what it was like for really bright, loving children to struggle coming into our world in various ways. So they taught me a lot about cognitive, linguistic, and emotional dimensions of learning. But in one of them, my daughter in particular, she had a difficulty with reading, which so stunned me when I started to drop into the perspective of a struggling reader and its cognitive, linguistic, and emotional consequences, that it inspired a process called Children of the Code, where I spent a couple of years traveling around the country. I interviewed 100 and something of the top scholars and scientists who had anything to say about reading and learning to read, from scratching on bones all the way through the history of the code to today, through the neuroscience and psychological and linguistic lenses of what's going on inside the virtual reality experience that we call reading, and how it's produced and why it's so difficult that so many kids have struggled with it, and what the collateral effects are to their life trajectories, to their faith in their own agency because of their protracted struggle. So, from that, I went on to develop a series of learning to read interventions. Um, and I'm currently, and that's kind of a side conversation we could have someday if you're interested in the reading dimensions of this. But my core thing has always been the question you're asking, right? The mission of education, the purpose of education. And I've been writing. I have a website and hundreds of articles and posts and what have you related to learning, redefining learning, because I think at the core of our educational problems is we have a fundamentally learning disabling conception of learning. So that's kind of the center of my business. So in the core business, I'm told when I say that, that's being in quotes, I'm totally nonprofit 501c3. I don't do anything for money. I do things because this is what I think is the most important thing to be doing.
So, in 30 years of investigation and collaboration and reflection and research, I'm curious, why do you believe that focusing on really the experience of learning, as I look in your materials, and also the impact that learning institutions have on us? In particular, I was struck by this experience of mind shame. So, when you said your daughter was struggling with learning to read, so when we don't get the thing delivered in this particular way that may not be for us, um, yeah, I'm curious, how have you come to this conclusion, this focus on the experience, right, and the happening moment by moment of learning?
Because that's the only part that's really important. I mean, education is always from the outside in. It's always an adultopomorphic, um, abstract overlay lens and machine to try to conduct, this process. But from the inside out, in a human being, it's an active, live. It's the center of our being. It's the live edge of our being and doing at all times, right? So one first of all, I want to acknowledge that you brought up mind shame. To me, that's the most powerful and widespread society-wide phenomena in terms of what I call an acquired learning disability. A lot of people talk about learning disabilities in the narrow defines of a structurally, maturationally ordained neurobiological learning disability, right? But our problems in our society are not structurally, maturationally, neurobiologically ordained learning disabilities. They're learned learning disabilities. We learn in ways that disable our learning. And inside that, there are two different components to it. There's maladaptive cognitive schema, meaning I learn in some way that's misorienting my learning thereafter, right? And so you see this in reading and math in a number of ways where people get habituated to unhelpful guessing strategies, right?
Hmm.
Instead of staying in the edge and learning their way through something. And then the bigger problem, which you touched on, mind shame, is what happens when we develop a preconscious emotional aversion to how bad it feels to be wrong in learning. And just like if we develop a preconscious aversion to our body, right, and we hide in it, right, or our singing voice or whatever it is. I mean, people talk about shame in many different dimensions. What I'm trying to bring into it is there's also a learning shame, there's a mind shame, and that the majority of our kids, because of their protracted difficulty with a number of artificial learning challenges, that's another whole conversation, the distinction between natural and artificial. But because of their difficulties with artificial learning challenges and our inability to conduct them in an individuatedly helpful way, right, they develop a self-blame and shame that now becomes a retardant, a interference, a distraction, again, an aversion to the kind of attentional engagement they need to succeed. So it's profoundly learning disabling. We all have some of it. If you think about your own experience, there's
Yeah,
things that
yeah.
you think about, oh, I feel stupid about that, and so we become averse to that which causes us to feel it. So I'm saying a significant dimension of our population has learned to be ashamed of their minds in ways that's disabling their learning.
That sounds crippling, right? And it leads me to a core belief that I have. Like ultimately, as any educator, anywhere, coach, mentor, any aspect, especially in this kind of asymmetrical relationship that we have in our institutions, right, of the adult and the child. Um, at its best, we learn and teach I can, right? Because if a student believes I can, especially I can learn, right, they can apply that throughout their lives. But essentially, what we're learning is I can't.
Yeah,
Um,
this is like the argument of the self-esteem movement. I differed with that back in the day. I was part of that in its inception and early development. There's a difference between telling a child they can and their chronic, real-time, high-frequency experience of not being able to. You can't, you can't, you can't con them out of their first-person experience with platitudes about all the fluffy things we say to them, right? I mean, it's better that we say it than we don't, but let's not confuse the fact that if their chronic experience day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year is feeling not good enough in engaging, right, then whatever you're saying up on the surface isn't getting down to the level that their emotional intelligence is working to avoid that bad feeling.
so what's working then from your perspective? What do you recommend? Approaches, models,
Well, before we get to
framework?
that, I think there's a couple of more parts to this, right? So the first thing is that, as I mentioned before, I think the flip point is redefining learning. Most people think of learning as an ancillary mental utility, like one of the things we do. We drive a car, we ride a bike, we go for a run. We learn, we go to school, we learn, we do this. Rather than learning is the central dynamic of being human in every dimension, not genetically programmed. I mean, in every way, we become who we learn to become. It's not something, it's not just I learn, I am learned, right? It's much more profound and fundamental to us. And so that's one thing. Another distinction that's often failed to make is the distinction between natural and artificial modes of learning, right? I mean, the difference between learning that is informed by live on the edge proprioceptive differentiation, like walking and talking and learning to differentiate different sounds in nature, or learning to taste the difference between this thing. Those things all happen right on the live edge of participating in the doing of it, right? They're not abstract. They're not based on a bunch of conventions that humans invented. The things that kids struggle with the most are all of the abstract human invented conventional things, not the natural things, but we blur them together, right? So there's a series of distinctions, and we don't have time to go into all of that. But I would say, based on that, what I've come to is that the mission of education, especially in light of the species level challenges and the species level's uncertainties surrounding our epoch, our time, in our moment in history, with AI and politics being what it is, and global and weather changes and everything else, we can't say for sure what's going to make for a successful life for a child 20 years from now in terms of what we should be teaching them. What we can say for sure is 20 years from now, nothing will be more important to how well they inhabit themselves, how well they inhabit and participate in the world, than how well they're learning, how well they're able to learn whatever it is they need to learn when they get there. So that's a different mission for education, is to prepare them to be as if nothing's more important to their future than how well they can learn when they get there. Suggests that at any given point in education, nothing we have to teach is more important than how well they're participating, how healthily they're attentionally engaged, how confident they are in themselves as learners, in their learning agency. And in that sense, education as we currently conceive it is 180 degrees out of phase with that.
So how do we how do we foster
The,
this?
the flip point is for more people to understand that nothing we have to teach is more important than how well they learn. So then once we start to care about how well they learn, then we start opening the door to asking questions. Well, what is it about their internal participation that's not learning objective particular? In other words, it's learning universal. So now then we start to get into how well they're able to sense their own learning needs, their own meaning needs, right? How well they're able to take that doesn't feel right, and differentiate that out into a form of action so that they're driving and participating in their learning and getting ever more confident in their ability to do that. So there's a whole lot of things that come on the other side of realizing that need to flip. That becomes the kind of rabbit hole for learning about the next steps.
Again, I'm really thinking about our K-12 system as it is. I'm working with a superintendent right now who can't quite say this publicly to the institution, but it says, what are we doing with the 6-period school day? We need to just radically reform that to prepare for the next 30 years and have a more dynamic educational environment. Does this even happen in buildings that we're sending a bunch of same age students to at the same time? So what is your vision of how this gets implemented, or how do we actually
Yeah, I think we have to back into it from first of all, we have to have this concern that I'm saying, that we have to have we have to convene based on an agreement that nothing's more important than how well they can learn, how well they're participating in their learning. That we have curricular objectives. And there's a thought experiment that I used to use back in the 90s that's helpful for that. So let me kind of take a tangent migration into that for a moment. So back then, which has kind of come to pass now, I used to say, okay, so imagine a device like this. And I can ask it any question I can imagine, anything about anything known to any human being that's ever existed. And it can respond. It can respond in a way that actually uses my idioms, my language, my vocabulary, what have you. So it really connects with me, and it helps me understand whatever it is I formulate a question on. Okay, great. Now I give this to a 4-year-old. What are they going to do with it?
scribble? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're going to stick it in. In other words, having all of that resource power doesn't necessitate that they will ask the right questions that will lead them to the kind of agency and capacities that will be necessary to survive in their world. Therein is the dividing line for me between the resourcing side of education and the legitimacy and the necessity of curriculum. right?
You,
So that's one dividing line. So let me step back and say, I'm not going to answer your question in some bing, 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 bing way, because I don't think we're anywhere close to that yet. I think what we need to do is to say we need to have a group of the right kind of thinkers come together with bringing different modes of experience and agree on some things to become the framework of a dialogue that gets us to what you're talking about. Okay, and those distinctions are differentiating natural and artificial learning, understanding the difference between healthy and unhealthy learning, understanding the value of focusing more on the learning and thinking of content and whatever we think is our learning objective at any given time as the scaffolding for exercising that participation. But it's never more important than that participation. Never, right? So those are some of the components. The next thing is what is the realm in which humans should be teaching children, and what is the realm in which technology should? So what's the way that I differentiate that is that, and we touched on this earlier, I don't know if it was before we started recording or not, but there's a dialogical process of learning together, right? That is going to be a valuable part and a necessary part of any human future, right? How do we learn together? So there's an aspect to that that's contentless, that's content agnostic, right? About how we learn to participate together. And we could do an episode on that about how to learn how to suspend your assumptions in light of the flow. I mean, that's a whole thing, right? And then we get there's a role for humans in facilitating dialogical learning in the way that I just described, right? But when it comes to artificial modes of learning, and by that I mean reading as an example, right? That's technology anyway. This comes back to until we make the collective distinction between natural and artificial modes of learning, then we have got this kind of religious affinity for how we should teach things that's really sloppy, that's really misoriented and misorienting of education. So reading is an artificially inseminated language experience, right? A code instructed and informed virtual language production, right? It's entirely dependent on an archaic artifact, the code itself, right? So there's entirely different ways to teach that to a developing child that leverages their interests, their vocabulary, that unfolds in dynamic dance with their minds, the distinctions that are necessary to get up on the skis, so to speak, of reading and take off with it. That doesn't have anything to do with the way we teach reading today. Very little to do with it, right? That allows them to get to meaning and to learn the phonemic distinctions and the phonical distinctions that are necessary to recognize words, but not in this offline, abstract, brain training way that we do it today, right? So, but that's an example of separating an aspect of the curriculum that right now there's all kinds of religious warfare about, but actually is a completely artificial, machine-like learning process anyway, right?
so where does the natural world fit into this? I'm curious.
I think one of the things that I liked so much about the Esalen school is that their thing was, let's ground them in their bodies before we pull them through their heads, you know? And so the natural world is an environment where the human steward is there unfolding their perception into the natural world, into things. So there's both a discovery process, but there's also guided learning. And that's where you want a human agent. I mean, there was a paper I wrote back in the 90s that I called the Invisor, which is kind of like a alternate augmented reality system that we're working on today, where I do think there'll be a point where children have devices where they can look at a tree and see a kind of overlay of its evolutionary existence, its participation, and so all this other information cloud can constellate around whatever they're doing, but ultimately most important kind of learning is the learning to collaborate, to be human together, and that
Being
it's
relational.
not it's not so much that I don't want technology to interfere with that, but what's interfering with that is overextending that into technology.
Mm,
Right? So there are certain things that I mean, people have very strange distinctions about what they consider technology. So they consider the computer technology, but they don't consider a book technology. Or they, you know,
yeah.
there's a series. That's why I'm saying there's a series of key distinctions between natural and artificial, healthy and unhealthy, learning as the central dynamic versus the utility, the difference between volitional learning, where I'm an active participant, and a kind of entrainment conditioning.
Mhm.
There's unconscious automatic learning that's happening at different stages. So we need to have all of these things in a new kind of soup that says, again, nothing's more important to our children's futures than how well they can learn when they get there. And that means caring for, stewarding the healthiness of their participation so as to never let whatever they're learning about be so much trouble that it causes them to feel not good enough at learning in a way that becomes self sabotaging. And that from that central principle, then we can start to say, okay, now what do we want to learn about? Knowing that technology is going to take care of the informational parts,
Yeah.
right? So, what's human parts? What's the spiritual parts? What's the uh, deep together humanity parts that we want now to focus on? So, in order to get to a kind of future, I think all these elements need to be brought together.
How well are we learning? That's what I'm hearing, this kind of core
Yep.
question.
Yeah.
Always.
Always the core. I mean, it's either that or there's an adult assumption that's basically a molding, formatting of
Yeah.
children.
Yeah. And
That's how
that's
we got
also
into the messes we got.
yeah, yeah, right. That no, that banking educate, we're gonna open your brains and pour in some information. But in this question, how well are we learning? The students are also assessing this.
Yes. But, and they're the most important assessors in the sense that, well, if a child was learning to walk and the feedback from beginning to fall came in a quarter of a second late, they'd never learn to walk. All of their natural learning is calibrated on responding to the feedback they're getting on the living edge of participating. That's what we're humans, that's how we got here. We're great at that. We can, from skateboarding to dancing and singing and imagining, right? But it's the
Does,
live. Go ahead.
does the question become then what do we as institutions and educators put in front of them to respond to and with?
Yes, yes, yes. And that here's one of the most beautiful things I ever experienced in thinking about all this is what I call the miraculous intersection, which is that if you if you're a learner, the most powerful source of internal information from which to proceed, right, comes from your own stutters in the flow. In other words, here you are, you're tracking something, and all of a sudden, oops, something's not right. Rather than blowing that off, if you differentiate, disambiguate, kind of sense into that, that's what gives you the information about what question to ask, what thing to do next in order to keep moving yourself, right? So that's the best possible source of internal information to proceed from it as a learner. If you go from the other perspective and say, what's the best possible source to cost optimally provide resources that will support really good learning, it's knowing where and when children are stuttering on the edge of their learning, right?
Mm.
So there's this miraculous connection between those two. And that requires both teachers that are sensitive to that. And so they've got to be aware of these distinctions we were talking about, natural and artificial and all the rest of them, and technology, which will ultimately be able to do that. So one of the things I'm working on now is with a internet design group, designing the future of the way the web will interact and support children and in learning. And the core of that is nothing's more important than creating an opportunity for them to register their stutters in the flow, their uncertainties, their curiosities, their learning needs, their meaning needs. Because not only is it the best way to learn what to do to provide for them, but if we don't do that, we're creating an environment that's causing them to learn, heck, there's no value thinking about that.
So
So
the stutters
we just
actually stop them as opposed to finding a
exactly
way to
causes them
engage.
to blur out to paying attention to what's the very fountain of their capacity for learning.
I've taught around the concept and engaged with teaching teams and different projects around a mistake safe culture, and it sounds similar to what you're getting at here. These stutters in learning, that when we are stumped, we can get curious, which can lead to all kinds of good things, healing and knowledge and liberation. And it seems if we're being trained for that we're actually halting that and kind of stagnating there. So again, like I sound, I mean, it kind of comes back to this very kind of the theme out of these interviews already now of a humanizing kind of relational priority for especially our adults in our systems, to be aware and to even notice where these moments are occurring for young people.
Yep, yep, yep. I think that in the name of educating children, we have created environments that systematically and pervasively teach them thousands, if not millions of times, no use paying attention to their interior learning needs. They're irrelevant. So
Dismiss.
in the name of educating them, we've taught them to blur out to what's the most powerful internal power they have with respect to learning. Yeah. and with respect to teachers, I make a distinction between stewarding learning and teaching. And the stewarding learning can only come from somebody who's first person learning oriented in their teaching. That teaching is their own form of learning. Always. They're always learning on the edge of their teaching. There's no separation between the two. The moment teaching is something different than learning in the way that they compartmentalize it, then we might as well get an AI system in there.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's rich. There's something very much and that's how I feel like at my best, is that we're all at the edge in this space together. And there's a Parker Palmer frame that, this concept of the subject matter in the middle, and we all relate to that content, that subject matter, and to each other. I mean, even things, so I get to serve in a state juvenile prison, and I can put violence in like, okay, let's examine and think about men's violence in particular. And we've all learned what that means, how that is, as perpetrators, as victims, but that we all can relate to this phenomenon in our lives, and then to each other in this process of learning. So I'm curious how to then expand this relational opportunities, right? These relational moments in that stutter.
Well, there's for my part, there's 3 different tracks that I'm working on. One has to do with AI ethics, the future of AI's ethics as it relates to facilitating learning, because AI scares me about short-circuiting the very process we were just talking about. That AI is going to come in and say, oh, this is what you need. And before learners have had a chance to differentiate their needs, they're going to be intruded upon with a solution that shuts them down. And so that's one dimension. Another dimension is the ethics of interface conversation for the World Wide Web. Those are technological projects. And third, and I actually came to you through them, is the ethics in education conversation. Right. So I'm kind of joining and participating in that. And that's more about the human side of all this. So I think all these things have got to converge. But with respect to teachers and us as individuals, I don't think we can be good stewards of our children's learning unless we're also good stewards of our own learning. There's one way to learn about learning as an academic, like it's a motor on the wall. There's a schematic over here, and I'm going to look at this part and this part and this part. But there's another way to look at learning, which is that it's happening 24/7 in front of our nose, between our eyes. It is what we are doing all the time. One of the things that really bothers me, that I push back on quite a bit, is the notion of lifelong learner, as if we could be otherwise. We don't say lifelong breather. We don't say lifelong heartbeater, right?
Yeah, yeah.
From conception to death, we are always becoming who we're learning to become in every way, right? And so when we realize that and start paying attention to that, it informs how we relate to other people in a way that makes us more able to be stewards rather than teachers. And I don't mean to demean teachers. They're my favorite people in the world, but teachers in the old world sense of being, projectile directives,
So what calls to action would you offer for listeners to this really in-depth, it's for me both I feel kind of intellectually stimulated here, and also my heart is very much being pulled into these questions, into this dialogue. So what would you offer listeners in terms of just calls to action? What can we do?
I think the first thing that I think would really help pull people into this is to start paying attention to what they avoid. Watch how your own emotionality disables your own learning by directing your attention away from where you need to learn. The more that you realize that and see that happening around you, the more that you start to understand learning, another dimension of learning. So I think before taking action, although I am involved in many groups, and I'd like to be involved in a group with you at some point that we can, convene people that are interested in the kind of transformative reboot of education that's necessary, right? And
and really, sorry, excuse me. I want to be clear that my investigation here, even in this question, is to call for, we need a renaissance in education.
Yeah.
Right. We need a whole, not just a reform, but we need to innovate here.
Yeah.
In order for our young people to have any response in 30, 50 years to where we are.
Absolutely. I am with you. In my point of view, education is not a little bit wrong. And I think most educational efforts, I used to analogize this, you might find this funny. I used to say it's kind of like rearranging the litter box and expecting a new kind of cat. It's kind of like changing the way that you're describing a meal on a menu and expecting it to change the taste, right? Yeah. It's like totally disconnected. Right now, the way education is its orientation is 180 degrees out of phase with stewarding the kind of healthiness in learning that's got to be what the center of the education if we really care about that. The other thing is that, and this is kind of a spiritual, I don't know how to describe this, but I have this deep abiding faith in humanity's capacity to learn. That's how we got here, right? Each of our children have that, right? They have this enormous capacity to learn. I trust that a whole lot more than I trust our wisdom in how to teach them what to do. And especially given the state of the world today, right? I mean, our politics are a dipstick into our learning disabilities, right? So bottom line, I guess the takeaway is, I know we're running out of time, is pay attention to your own learning. And from a deeper first person appreciation of the role of learning in your life, how much it's affected your life, how much of who you are you've learned to become that way, rather than it just happened to you, like so much of our languaging does. And from that, join up with us or others like us in learning our way to a transformation.
I'm leaving this conversation with a real focus for me, a real call to consider, think about, engage that first person experience, both my own and growing the awareness of, clients, students. There's something very simple and profound about growing that inner awareness. Even lately, on a real kind of just personal note, when you talk about spirit, today at a team meeting, I said, I heart therapy, right? Just for my own exploration and just my own learning about how I'm functioning and all the learning I've taken in from my family and all the things is liberating. It is a liberating experience for me personally to be self-aware and to be deeply more layered of self-awareness. It's freeing. It's so freeing. So I'm leaving here with this kind of focus of what does school do to our spirits, right? So the question I might want to ask you on the way out here is what did school do for your spirit? What was your educational experience like? Did
I
it? How
hated
did it?
school. I
Yeah.
hated school. A way to nail what you just said for me is that's evocative, and maybe some of the listeners or viewers would get this, is that have you ever met a toddler who gave up on learning to walk because it was a pain in the ass to fall?
No, I've never met one.
Okay. They have, they don't acquire it, they don't learn it. They have it, a comes with them with the package, inherent faith in their own agency to learn their way into life until they learn otherwise.
Hmm. That's a
We
great
got to
phrase.
we got to conduct that into our
Yes.
world rather than chop that off in the way of formatting them into our world.
Yeah. So what's fascinating though as well here is what you're saying. It's innate. It's innate in us as humans, and our institutions are actually not supporting that.
But it's not innate in us to learn in artificial ways, like a machine with
Yeah.
machine regularity, and that's why that distinction is so important. What's innate in us is to be presence extending on the live edge of our living and learning and doing. Right, that's what's innate. That's what we. That's how we got here. That's what we come with. But we're now challenged with living in a completely complexly confusing artificial world, including the way education functions. That's a different thing. The children will come for that. We got to conduct them through it. But we got to make the center of that conductance a care for that center of their being learning rather than our mental model of what they should be learning.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, it is an honor to speak with you, a privilege, and I look forward to more. Thank you for being part of this project.
The honor and privilege was mine. Thank you. I look forward. I hope we can talk some more.
Thank you so much.
Recording stopped.
You're brilliant, man. Thank you. I appreciate this.
Thank you. No, hey, we're on this enough of a same wavelength we can communicate, which is a beauty, a gift, a delight. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your frame, your career, your obviously your passion, but also language is so important to me. And even as I prepare for this run, it's back to this humanizing the theme out of all of this. And you'll get to see different people that I've interviewed from all life experiences, but it's back to our humanity. I mean, and so how can institutions and schools in particular be a humanizing experience?
When you get to run, think about this. I think the average parent in America today is sufficiently nervous about the state of the world. Even if they're climate deniers and they love Trump, right? They're still sufficiently nervous about the state of the world and the implications of AI. I mean, one of the things we didn't talk about is that we're going to enter my thought experiment, right? We're entering a phase in which not only can anything we can imagine get answered instantly by technology, but we can learn on the edge of whatever we need by technology. So the first time I'm ever working on a capacitor problem in a power supply, what am I doing? Boom, it can guide me there, right? So the idea of being pre-educated or pre-trained rather than being educated or trained in the moment of need, right? That's going to diminish. But we're also talking about a world in which, I mean, Elon Musk is talking about in a couple of years having a robot that can watch you do anything a human can do with its hands and feet and also and do it. It'd be the price of a car, right?
Yeah.
So between AI, which I've been writing about this for decades, displacing college professors in doing subjective analysis of somebody's thought process in a PhD thesis, we got AI doing that stuff. but we're also going to have them, flipping burgers and doing every kind of menial job. So what are humans going to do?
That's my question as well. I'm holding this very same question. Yes.
Okay, well, exactly. So what we can say for sure is whether or not humans are going to be able to compete with these machines, they're going to have to learn to adapt to the world that they're existing in with those machines, right? So I think the average parent can understand that, especially given the complexity, the rate of change, the uncertainty, the world's planetary scale challenges, the AI that's looming, and all that stuff, that the idea of training children with some particular model of what they're going to be, what the world's going to be like, is crazy.
Yeah. We don't know.
Right?
Yeah.
The only thing we can say for sure is that how well they can learn when they get there is going to be the greatest asset they have. And what I look, this is why it's so important, though, to break out of learning out of the utility mode, so that it now includes learning is what causes premature death. I mean, one of the things I
Yeah.
do in audience, how many of you have ever given thought to how profoundly unhealthy learning can be? Most people don't. But everything,
No, even reading your stuff, it's like a real kind of course, it's like, a slap in the face.
yeah,
And
almost
obvious.
everything
Yeah.
that goes wrong in the world is the consequence of our learning,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So I think there's an argument to be made for the general population that says what we've been talking about today relative to the need to change education, and that I would be love to help work with you to formulate that, if that was an interesting pillar
Yeah.
plank of your run.
No, that's so really my three are humanizing institutions, which for me are about age developing agency and having access, and special education reform. That's a whole area itself. Comprehensive mental health infrastructure. That's, if I can do that in 4 years, that's really like the core. Other states have it. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's just about funding, and we got to figure that out. But giving students access to for acute, mental distress, and like, my best friend's son took his own life at 16 5 years ago. Like these things are just so real and I don't know what their life is like.
Shames the driver.
Yeah. I've explored shame in terms of my work with boys and men and rethink manhood, and my whole other process of going to the juvenile institutions and all of that. But and then the third is this innovation, right? Is this educational, this call for renaissance, because I look at the last 100 years, and we've got, how have humans adapted to just our own innovation? From, we get the car at the end of the century, then planes, antibiotics, right? Birth control, nuclear power, weapons, space race, home computer, internet, smartphone, now social media, now AI, right? And so how are we preparing kids for the next 100 years? Because we've been doing education the same throughout all that time. Like, what are we doing? Why are we not innovating? Yeah.
And the digital revolution, the way I put it is first of all, exactly right. What's happening now is on an evolutionary scale, right next to standing upright and talking. Right? I mean, it's not an incremental innovation, right? So there's the three codes: the code of speaking, which we never explicitly learn; the code of reading and writing, which our civilization, my documentary was called Children of the Code, and it's a story of how becoming code users built the world we live in.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because of the abstract distance from language that doesn't exist in native primal people they don't have writing systems, right? So what writing did, what code use did to enable our minds to become so artificial, so artificially powerful, right? But AI and the digital revolution and its next child, the AI system, we're in the primitive infancy of that.
Yeah.
It's unimaginable